Hey guys, and welcome back for another episode of my midweek mystery series, where today we don't have a mystery but instead a video about the darker side of human nature. We're going to be taking a look at 3 dark social experiments that have actually been conducted in the last century, mostly before there were solid guidelines around the ethics of such things. Social experiments and ethics don't often go hand in hand. But first, I want to thank the sponsor of this week's video, Aura. We talk a lot on my channel about personal safety, how to keep yourself safe when out and about, how to protect yourself. But have you ever put that much thought into your digital security? Think about all of your online accounts, finances and devices. What are you doing to protect them? Like most people, you're probably reusing the same passwords all over the internet. And a data breach to any one of those services could cause trouble for you everywhere else. Every 10 seconds, someone becomes a victim of fraud or identity theft, and a lot of those people never recover their stolen money. Aura can help protect you online. It's a new type of security service that protects your online data, connection, and devices with one simple subscription. With Aura's easy online dashboard and alerts sent straight to your phone, you'll get alerted to fraud and threats fast. If account details or a password get leaked online, or if somebody tries to open a bank account in your name, you'll know about it. Aura will also protect your devices from malware and encrypt your Wi-Fi so you can go about your online business in private. If you do encounter any issues, the online dashboard will guide you through the process of solving them. All plans come with $1 million in identity theft insurance to help you should you have any funds stolen, and experienced US-based customer support. For the moment, Aura is only available for my US viewers, which I know is the vast majority of you, but it's such an important service that I didn't want to miss out on spreading this message. So if you want to secure your online presence from hackers, scammers and noisy advertising companies, go to aura.com/Georgia where you'll get 40% off all plans. That's aura.com/Georgia. The first experiment I want to start with today is something called the Monster Study, conducted in Davenport, Iowa in 1939. Dr. Wendell Johnson arrived at the University of Iowa in 1926 to study English, pushed towards English and the written word as he'd had a severe stutter throughout his life. The stutter never affected his life too negatively. According to an article in the New York Times, he was the class president and valedictorian of his high school, and he was considered the class clown. His stutter didn't hold him back, but it did motivate him. He went to the University of Iowa for a reason. It had the most famous stuttering research centre in the world, where he wanted to receive help for his own stutter. But once at university, Wendell Johnson ended up switching his master's to psychology, eventually becoming a speech pathologist himself. He worked closely with other stuttering students throughout his master's, and they would all use each other as guinea pigs. They would draw blood, hook themselves up to electrodes, electroshock therapy. All the students would even startle each other with gunshots to see if that had any effects on speech. It didn't, but interestingly that would affect normal speakers. The study of stuttering became Wendell Johnson's entire life. In the 1930s, it was thought that stuttering was genetic, that you were born a stutterer and that was it. Little could be done about it. And stuttering is something which is said to affect 1 in 100 people, with more than 70 million stutterers worldwide. And at its simplest, it's defined as a speech disorder that causes the flow of speech to be broken up. Some have milder cases, others have it more seriously. About 5% of children aged 2 to 5 will develop stuttering in their childhood, which can last anywhere from a few weeks to several years. Whilst most will recover by the age of 7 or 8, 1 out of 100 will be left with long-term stuttering. We know today there are 4 factors most likely to contribute to stuttering: genetics, child development, neurophysiology, and family dynamics. And there are a number of treatments that can be used for both children and adults, although there's no miracle cures for stuttering. Of course, most of this wasn't known back in the 1930s. The department's lead professors at the time thought the stuttering was caused by misdirected brain signals, and they used a new device called an electromyograph to study neuromuscular activity in both stutterers and non-stutterers. The testing showed that stutterers had more subtle neuromuscular responses than non-stutterers. But Dr. Johnson thought otherwise. He didn't think the stuttering was genetic. He said that he'd spoken fine until he was 5 or 6 years old, until a teacher pointed out a slight stutter. From there, he grew worse, the nervousness producing disordered speech. It was a learned behaviour, he was convinced. He theorised that labelling a child as a stutterer could actually make them worse, and in some cases could even cause worse speech in normal talkers. By 1938, he had conducted a series of case studies with families and stuttering children, where he discovered that each child had been given the label of stutterer at a very young age. He wrote, "Stuttering begins in the ear of the listener, not in the mouth of the child." He thought that parents, by drawing attention to the child's problems, would make the child self-conscious, and therefore the problems would persist. Put simply, the child would overthink it. He knew better than anyone how emotionally difficult it was having a speech disorder, how difficult it makes socialising and making friends, the isolation it leads to. Being a speech pathologist, the idea of this could be a revelation in the field, if only he could prove it. But how was he going to do that? Well, by using orphan children, of course. Now, he probably knew that he would never get permission from parents to do such a thing, and orphan children didn't have parents to give consent, they kind of just fell through the cracks. So he turned to the state-run Iowa Soldiers Orphans Home, which was already being used by the university in another study, so it was easy to get permission. By autumn 1938, Johnson had this permission to begin his experiment, although he wasn't going to tell the teachers at the orphanage what he was actually doing, just in case they messed with his experiment. It was all very secretive. He called in 22-year-old graduate student Mary Tudor to help him conduct his experiment, because she was great with children, and he told her that she could use it for her thesis, to which she agreed enthusiastically. At its basis, the theory made sense to her. So the experiment was to go something like this. They, Mary mostly, would take 22 children, none of whom were told what the research was actually going to be about, but they were told they were going to receive speech therapy. 10 of the children were stutterers and 12 were not, and they were put into pairs depending on similarities between age, sex, IQ, and language fluency. Randomly, the paired children would then be assigned either a control group or an experimental group. Children in the control group would be labelled as normal speakers, and they would receive positive therapy. Children in the experimental groups would be labelled stutterers and would be given negative therapy, and it didn't matter if they were actually stutterers or normal speakers, they were just assigned at random. Mary Tudor was mostly left in charge of this study. She was to ensure that the children in the control group knew what stuttering was and that they were showing signs of it, even if they weren't. She was to systematically alert them to their speech, stopping and lecturing them whenever they repeated words. She would say, "Take a breath before you say the word if you think you're going to stutter on it. Stop and start over if you stutter. Put your tongue on the roof of your mouth. Don't speak unless you can speak correctly. Watch your speech all the time. Do anything to keep from stuttering." She would tell them this over and over again. And she would tell the teachers and the matrons as well, telling them they also had to pull up on the children when they made speech mistakes. And Mary found this whole thing really difficult. She didn't find it natural to tell off the children, but she believed it was for the greater good. The experimental set were always told their speech was fine, even if it wasn't. And the experiment lasted from January until late May 1939, with Mary turning up every week or two for new sessions. It only took a few sessions for some interesting things to begin to show. The control group's children's speech was indeed getting worse. One 12-year-old girl called Mary Kolaski was told in the first session that she'd repeated a word, and that if she didn't improve, she would begin to stutter as badly as her partner in the study, Dorothy. Mary Tudor noted immediately that her repetition started to come more frequently, so she would get admonished more frequently. By the middle of March, Mary Kolaski had troubles pronouncing her W's, R's and S's. And Mary was just one of many. A lot of the other control students also showed marked deterioration in speech. One 6-year-old girl spoke freely at the beginning of the experiment. By the end, she was barely speaking anymore. Other children's grades plummeted and they began to get bullied. One 15-year-old girl even showed deterioration in her writing skills, writing the same word multiple times in a row sometimes. And Mary Tudor could see this happening. Her excitement about the project waned and she began to get upset. She'd report back to Johnson hoping that he would end the experiment, but he just got excited. It proved his hypothesis. On May 24th, 1939, they both attended the orphanage for the final testing. It was found that the experimental group speech had deteriorated for 5 of the 6 normal speakers and 3 of the 5 stutterers. In the control group, only 1 child suffered more speech interruptions. So Johnson and Tudor moved on with their lives at the end of the experiment, whilst the children felt the effects for the rest of their lives. However, not all of the children were affected by the study. One of the normal children, who was falsely labelled a stutterer, actually had hugely increased speech fluency, the negative feedback causing them to improve their already good speech. 2 of the stutterers who were given positive feedback also showed improvement. Mary Tudor wrote in her thesis, "All of the children in this group showed overt behavioural changes that were in the direction of the types of inhibitive, sensitive, embarrassed reactions shown by many adult stutterers in reaction to their speech. There was a tendency for them to become less talkative." Whilst many of the children still spoke fine at the end of the study, they would shuffle their feet, whisper, gulp, gasp, show reluctance to speak at all. You can make somebody feel self-conscious about their speech, it seems, so their behaviours reflect that, but you cannot force them to become stutterers. This study feels quite personal to me. I'm obviously a person who speaks for a living, ironically, because public speaking is up there with my worst fears. I was always the quiet kid in school. I've always been used to having to say things more than once to get heard. I was already self-conscious of my speech, and now speaking for a living with people commenting on my speech freely, I'm more conscious of the way I speak than ever before. I can't stand the sound of my own voice now in editing. I'm overly conscious of the way I pronounce words and the structures of my sentences, the way my voice lifts and falls. One comment about the way I speak is enough to send me into a week-long spiral. It destroys me every time, and I've debated deleting my channel more than once because of this. And your speech isn't necessarily something you can change, or not easily at least. In fact, my voice has got worse since being open to internet critiques. I look back at my older videos and I speak so much more naturally. Now I overthink everything. I can only imagine that children having that sort of negative reinforcement on an even higher level than I get would be seriously affected. It would make you nervous every time you opened your mouth. When Mary released her thesis, Wendell Johnson didn't oversee its publication as he often did with other students. He didn't include it in his comprehensive index of stuttering research. The thesis sank into obscurity for many, many years. In fact, nobody really knew of it apart from speech pathology students at the university, who tended to refer to it as the monster study. But why the monster study? Apparently it reminded people of the human experiments conducted by the Nazis. World War II would begin not long after the experiment ended. That's also likely the reason Johnson never put his name to the thesis. Other professors warned him what it looked like. He realised too late what he'd done, but then he didn't want to be associated with it. Also, it probably didn't help that the thesis ultimately proved his hypothesis wrong, or at least it didn't prove anything. It proved that you can make people more self-conscious about their speech, but you can't make them a stutterer. He knew the pain firsthand of being told that you stutter, and he endorsed this test anyway. So the experiment remained in obscurity until 2001, when an investigative reporter at the San Jose Mercury News started to report on it. A book titled Ethics, a Case Study from Fluency was written to provide an impartial scientific evaluation of this experiment, but the multiple authors of this book were unable to come to a consensus on their thoughts around the ethics of it. This advertisement forced the university to come forward and apologise for their part in it, but that was little help for the victims who had long-lasting effects of the experiment. 3 of the surviving orphans, Norma Jane Pugh, Mary Kolaski and Hazel Potter, said that it caused years of emotional distress. Norma thought herself a freak all her life and still hates to talk. Hazel said she'd moved on and she talks okay, but she was always a quiet child after this. Them and 4 others each sued the state and the university for millions of dollars, eventually awarded a total of $1.2 million for lifelong psychological and emotional scars. They didn't form stutters, but they did form self-consciousness. Before her death, Mary Tudor expressed deep regret about her role in the study. She didn't entirely understand the repercussions at the time and maintained that Johnson should have done more to reverse the negative effects in the aftermath. She did return back to the orphanage 3 times after the end of the study to try and help, but she was unable to provide enough positive therapy to reverse what she'd done. What kind of effect do you think something like this would have on you? Our second dark social experiment today is something that you may well have heard of before. It's one of those things that sort of does the rounds on those snappy Facebook posts that people love to share. It's Jane Elliott's blue eyes versus brown eyes experiment, or as she prefers to call it, exercise. If you haven't heard of Jane Elliott before, and if you haven't, you should go and do a bit of research on her. She's described as an American diversity educator and an anti-racism activist. She's now aged 87 and she's this little old white woman who easily could have been incredibly racist considering the decade she grew up in. Instead, she operates a zero-tolerance, uncompromising approach to anti-racism. She told the New York Times in a 2020 interview, "I was born the year Adolf Hitler and Franklin Roosevelt came to power in 1933. I remember what the Nazis did from 1933 to 1945, and I saw that same thing happening in this country where skin colour is concerned." She says that racism is ignorance based on being miseducated. Racism is a result of being indoctrinated instead of educated. And ever since her brown eyes, blue eyes experiment, fighting racism, educating has been the main focus of her life. On the 4th of April 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. The next morning, Jane Elliott walked in to teach a 3rd grade class in Riceville, Iowa, a small, all-white town. Recently, the class had made Martin Luther King Jr. their hero of the month, and many of the students were upset and confused as to why their hero had been assassinated. So, putting her lesson plan to one side, Jane decides to teach her students a harsh reality about prejudice and what it can do to people. Jane divided her all-white students by eye colour into 2 groups. There were those with blue eyes and those with brown. On the first day, the blue-eyed children were told that they were nice, smarter, neater, and generally better than the children with brown eyes. Jane would praise these students throughout the day, and they would be given longer playtimes for no apparent reason, as well as letting them skip to the front of the lunch queue. The brown-eyed children were made to wear collars around their necks and were constantly criticised and ridiculed by the teacher. On the second day, the roles were reversed. Brown-eyed children were praised and blue-eyed children were criticised. And the effects of this were more shocking than Jane ever thought they would be. On both days, the inferior children took on the role fully, acting and looking more poorly, as well as doing worse in tests and other work. The superior students, who were before sweet kids, instantly became mean-spirited and loved to discriminate against the inferior group. It was fun for them. Jane said, "I watched what had been marvellous, cooperative, wonderful, thoughtful children turn into nasty, vicious, discriminating little third graders in the space of 15 minutes. She had created a microcosm of society in a third grade classroom. The idea behind such an experiment was so simple, the fact that something so genetically uncontrollable could be responsible for such hatred and prejudice. But it also showed so quickly how easy it is for groups of people to fall into their roles of the oppressor and the oppressed." The children were asked to write something about their experience once the exercise was over, and some of these were published in the local newspaper, the Riceville Recorder, just a couple of weeks later. They were published under the headline, "How Discrimination Feels," and on the back of this, Jane was asked to appear on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. It kind of went viral. You would think in an ideal world that this would have enticed a lot of positive feedback, but of course it didn't. Hundreds of negative calls started coming in immediately. One stated, "How dare you try this cruel experiment out on white children? Black children grow up accustomed to such behaviour, but white children, there's no way they could possibly understand it. It's cruel to white children and will cause them great psychological damage." Can anyone say double standards? Black kids were expected to have thick skin and deal with the hatred. How dare you harm our precious white children? And of course, the fact of the matter is, a 2-day-long classroom experiment in which both blue and brown-eyed children were able to experience both sides of the coin didn't really affect them at all. In fact, it opened their eyes and made them more compassionate to the struggles of people of colour. The most racist people were, and always are, the adults. Children don't learn racism unless you teach it to them. Jane Elliott was not popular in Riceville after this. The rest of the teachers at her school, bar one, refused to speak to her, and even her oldest daughter experienced effects of it at her high school. On her lunch break on the day of the exercise, Elliott said that she went into the teacher's lounge and told her colleagues about what she'd been doing. One teacher said, "I don't know why you're doing that. I thought it was about time somebody shot that son of a bitch." Elliott said that not a single other teacher reprimanded this woman or even corrected her. They all either smiled, laughed, or nodded. And this just strengthened Jane's resolve to go back to the classroom and continue the exercise. Her students, her innocent, happy students with the power to change the world, weren't going to leave her presence with those kinds of attitudes, she decided. Some of the people furious with Jane in the aftermath of this were just downright racist. Some thought that the children were too young to be exposed to such an experiment. In a 2003 interview, Jane said that about 20% of Riceville was still furious at her. But what do you think about this one? Not a single one of the children involved in this original exercise have ever really come forward saying they have long-lasting psychological effects of this. They say it opened their eyes to the suffering of others, but it was in a much more brutal way than other children probably would have learned it. I personally think there are a lot worse things that some teachers do to children in school nowadays that cause much longer lasting effects, but perhaps if the parents had been warned of the exercise beforehand, there may have been less backlash. But then again, would they have consented to it? Probably not. I don't think the same white parents would have been mad at black children actually being treated that way, but that's just me. One conservative columnist wrote in 2004 that Jane was a disgrace, saying, "You would think that any normal person would realise that she'd done an evil thing, but not Elliott. She repeated the abuse with subsequent classes and finally turned it into a fully commercial enterprise." Because Jane's exercise didn't end with just the one. Over the coming years, she would repeat it with new classrooms, and in 1970, ABC produced a documentary about her entitled The Eye of the Storm, and books been written about the experiment. You can watch the documentary on YouTube. I'll leave it linked down below just in case you're curious. Jane Elliott is considered to be one of the originators of diversity training. Her exercise is now used as the basis for a lot of the Western world's diversity training, and she's worked with some of the biggest companies in the USA. She eventually left her job as a teacher to focus on this full time. Academic research into this exercise does show moderate results in the reduction of long-term prejudice, but it's not known if the possible psychological harm outweighs the potential benefits. It's reported to be a stressful exercise for anyone who takes part, children or adults. She has also done the exercise with people of colour within the group, still splitting people by eye colour rather than skin colour. She said that it's really difficult to get people of colour to play the role of the oppressor during the exercise, that it doesn't come naturally to them. People of other colour groups seem to understand, she said, probably because they've been taught how they're treated in this country, that they have to understand us. White people, on the other hand, don't have to understand them. We have to let people find out how it feels to be on the receiving end of that which we dish out so readily. As for Jane Elliott, she says she's sick of hearing about this exercise nowadays. She's been repeating the same exercise for 52 years and society has come no further forward. There's been no easy fix for racism as a systemic problem. She said to the Morning Edition, "It's happening every day in this country right now. We are repeating the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise on a daily basis." Single people can educate themselves, work on their own biases and put in the work, but until a majority do that, this is going to be an ingrained societal problem. Jane Elliott is just a single white woman at the end of the day, and while she can help with diversity training, whether or not people agree with it, I don't know, there's only so much one person can do. She's not a saviour, she just got given this platform and uses it to speak out. And people do still consider her controversial, but at least she's doing something in a world where a lot of people are doing nothing. And our final experiment of the video is going to be the third wave, an experimental social movement created by a 25-year-old history teacher called Ron Jones in 1967. He taught at Palo Alto's Cubley High School in California, and year upon year in teaching about World War II, he's found himself asked the same question by his students. Why did people follow the Nazis if they were so clearly awful? How did they ignore the terrible things that were happening? So he decided to demonstrate in the only way he knew how, literally. He decided he was going to simulate fascism in his own classroom to show exactly how the Nazi Party rose to power 3 decades before. Ron Jones was said to be a well-liked teacher. He was charismatic and cool. Students looked forward to their lessons with him. He was one of the most popular teachers in school. Perhaps that contributed to how well this experiment went over the following days. He turned up to his 10th grade contemporary world history class one day and said, "We're going to do an experiment, a non-threatening experiment." He told them, "If you're an active participant, I'll give you an A. If you just go along with it, I'll give you a C. If you try a revolution, I'll give you an F, but if your revolution succeeds, I'll give you an A." And then he immediately began to act a lot more stern than usual. Bored students' ears suddenly perked up. This sounded like fun. They wanted to get an A, and this was going to be an easy way to do it. The experiment was only supposed to last for one day. Jones began by emphasising easy things, sit properly, back straight, drilling it into the students until they listened. If they didn't, he became authoritarian. They had no choice but to listen. They had to be sitting to attention before the second bell went off. They had to stand up to ask or answer questions, and they had to do it in 3 words or fewer, prefacing each time they spoke with "Mr. Jones." By the end of that first class, all students were sitting straight, listening, completely orderly. The lesson ended with just a few rules that the kids had been expected to abide by, and they had. It was supposed to end then, but when he arrived with the same class the next day, the students were already sitting straight back in their chairs. They greeted him with "Good morning, Mr. Jones" in unison. Why not continue the experiment for another day, he thought. He quickly came up with a name for the movement, the third wave, named after how the fact the third in a series of waves is always the strongest. He wrote the words "strength through community" on the chalkboard, and even went as far as creating a salute for the other students to identify each other with, both in and outside the classroom, inspired by the Hitler salute. Each student was given an individual task to complete, such as designing a third wave banner, stopping non-members from entering the class, even placing guards at the door, and recruiting friends to join the movement. And this is where things got out of hand, as it was no longer contained in the classroom. By the next day, the number of students in the third wave had increased from 30 to 43. The words "strength through action" were included on the chalkboard. Students were given membership cards, but only once they'd been able to demonstrate knowledge of the rules and pledge obedience. By the end of the day, there were 200 members. Jones told 3 students to come and report to him if other people weren't following the rules he'd set out. But soon, all sorts of students were coming to him tattling on others, with rule breakers being banished to the school library for their crimes. Jones would later say that it was this aspect that scared him the most, how easy they found it to do with no concern for the punishment of others. Interestingly, all the students showed dramatic improvements in their academic skills and incredible motivation. They wanted this to keep going. By this point, even the faculty of the school had joined in, with Jones later writing that the principal came into the afternoon faculty meeting and did the third wave salute to him, and the librarian had placed a banner above the library entrance. Jones said that the 3 most intelligent females in the class held back. They possessed this silent confidence as they just watched what else was going on, and they seemed stunned, but they still participated in a very mechanical fashion. It was expected, so they did it, even if it was clear they didn't particularly want to. These girls did tell their parents, and one of these parents' rabbis even ended up calling Jones, but when Jones told them they were just studying the German personality, the rabbi seemed delighted and told him not to worry, that he would talk to the parents and quell any concerns they had. The rabbi just accepted it and in a way became part of the experiment himself, in the same way the clergy had in Germany. By the 4th day, things were quite clearly getting out of control, and Jones decided it was time to draw things to a close. He said he was beginning to get worried. It was already clear by this point that he'd made his point that the students were loyal, they blindly followed every word he'd said. And why? He told students that the third wave was part of a nationwide movement, and that the next day a presidential candidate of the movement would be publicly announcing its existence on TV. There was to be a rally on the Friday to witness this. Of course, on the 5th day, the students turned up to this rally, where Jones had got a number of his friends to pretend to be reporters. The students carried third wave banners and chanted "strength through discipline, strength through community, strength through action." And then the TV was turned on to nothing but a blank screen. Jones announced to them this had all been part of an experiment to demonstrate how fascism happened, why people were so easy to just follow the Nazi party without really questioning what was going on. He told them there is no such thing as a national youth movement called the third wave. You have been used, manipulated, shoved by your own desires into the place you now find yourself. You are no better or worse than the German Nazis we have been studying. He apologised to the students but hoped that they now understood, and then played them a film about the Nazi regime, the Nuremberg Rally, to round off the experiment. Not a single student moved. Jones said he felt sick to his stomach. Through the experience of the past week, we have all tasted what it was like to live and act in Nazi Germany. We learned what it felt like to create a disciplined social movement, to build a special society, pledge allegiance to that society, replace reason with rules. Yes, we would have all made good Germans. We would have put on the uniform, turned our heads as friends and neighbours were cursed and then persecuted. And then the students left. In the 4 years that followed that Jones taught at Cubberley, not a single student ever admitted to attending the rally. The shame they felt was overwhelming. In the following years, some students have come forward talking of their experience with the third wave. One former student in a radio interview said that it was due to the tattling that it quickly became a climate of fear with rumours on top of rumours, but no one seemed to be able to stop. Friendships ended, trust was destroyed. Despite the emphasis on unity pushed forward by Jones, it was anything but united. Whilst in the first couple of days the students were aware it was a game, it quickly went way beyond that, and some reports say that it lasted beyond the 5 days, some students taking it seriously for a number of weeks. Jones also noted that whilst the more popular and academic students struggled to take it seriously, it was the quiet middle who stuck with it. The ones who didn't stand out were desperate for a place where they belonged, and they floated to the top of the third wave. Jones quickly moved past the experiment, but over a decade later he ran into one of his former students who gave him the third wave salute. He realised then that the whole thing ran deeper than he ever realised, and it was then that he wrote the details of the experiment up and shared it in the magazine Whole Earth Review. Whilst I would have thought that an experiment like this would have faced a lot of backlash, more than the blue brown eyes one, it certainly didn't seem like it did. I couldn't really find many negative critiques online about it at all. Instead, just lots of people praising the experiment for proving what so many people don't seem to understand. How easy it is to follow the crowd, how all humans want is to be accepted and fit in, to be praised. Perhaps this train of thought doesn't sound too familiar to you today. We see the same thing happening all around us, with huge movements happening all across the world every day, especially with the power of social media. People are desperate to belong. Think MAGA, QAnon, Brexit, anti-vax movements, but then also the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter. They're two sides of the same coin. People love to have something to follow, somewhere to belong, whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing. People love to follow the public opinion of the people closest to them. That's why educating yourself is so important, especially when it comes to social media. Don't just blindly retweet or parrot the information you saw on Facebook. Find academic research, find legitimate sources, read them, learn them. It's so easy just to get swept up. You won't even realise you do it, but you do. In the end, it comes down to this: people want to belong. It took only 5 days for a single teacher to radicalise hundreds of students. Exploitation is easy if you're not paying attention. Do you think you'd follow a fascist government if it happened? Would you even notice? I'm sure these students would now. Again, let me know what you think of this one. Thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you so much to Aura for sponsoring, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.